The spring of 1945 brought liberation to millions across Europe, but for some, it brought only terror. In a makeshift detention camp near Lüneburg, dozens of German women, former auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht, huddled in filthy barracks, expecting the worst when British soldiers approached. They had been told stories, propaganda tales of what would happen if they fell into enemy hands. So when the door swung open and 3 British sergeants stepped inside, the women recoiled, pressing themselves against the walls, some covering their faces, others trembling uncontrollably. But what happened next would shatter everything they had been taught to believe about their captors. Within minutes, these same women who had cowered in fear were weeping openly, not from cruelty, but from an act of simple human kindness that none of them had expected: the offer of clean clothes, soap, and dignity. This is the untold story of how British decency transformed enemies into human beings, and how one small gesture revealed the true character of a nation that had every reason for vengeance, yet chose compassion instead. The spring of 1945 arrived in northern Germany not with renewal, but with the acrid smell of defeat. By late April, the British Second Army under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had swept across the Rhine and driven deep into the German heartland, encountering scenes of devastation that defied comprehension. Towns lay in ruins, refugees clogged every road, and the once mighty Wehrmacht had disintegrated into scattered remnants, desperately seeking surrender rather than annihilation. In this chaos, British forces encountered something their training had scarcely prepared them for: thousands upon thousands of German women in uniform. These were the Nachrichtenhelferinnen, signals auxiliaries, the Stabshelferinnen, staff assistants, the Flakhelferinnen, anti-aircraft auxiliaries, women who had served the German war machine in roles that freed men for combat. As the collapse accelerated, these women found themselves abandoned by their male counterparts, left behind in the headlong retreat, suddenly vulnerable in ways that the chaos of total war made terrifyingly real. The British Army's advance into Lower Saxony in late April 1945 brought the 7th Armored Division, the famed Desert Rats, who had fought from El Alamein to the Baltic, into the town of Lüneburg, some 30 miles south of Hamburg. Here, amidst the medieval architecture and the spring blossoms that seemed obscenely cheerful against the backdrop of defeat, British military government officers faced an immediate crisis: what to do with the hundreds of German military women who had either surrendered or been rounded up in the surrounding area. The problem was unprecedented. The Geneva Convention provided clear guidelines for the treatment of male prisoners of war, but the mass capture of female military personnel presented complications that required immediate improvisation. Lieutenant Colonel James Hartley, a career officer from Yorkshire who had been appointed as the local military government commander, found himself responsible for the welfare of 347 German women, ranging in age from 18 to 45, all of whom had served in various capacities with German forces. "We hadn't the faintest idea what to do with them," Hartley would later recall in his unpublished memoirs, now held in the Imperial War Museum archives. "The detention facilities we'd established were designed for men, former SS, Wehrmacht officers, party officials. The idea of housing several hundred frightened women in the same conditions seemed both impractical and, frankly, indecent. The solution, arrived at, with characteristic British pragmatism, was to commandeer a former German military barracks on the outskirts of Lüneburg, a collection of wooden huts that had once housed Luftwaffe ground crew. The facility was surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by soldiers from the Durham Light Infantry, and administered by a hastily assembled staff of British military police and civil affairs officers who had absolutely no experience in managing female prisoners. The conditions the German women encountered upon arrival were grim. The barracks had been stripped of everything valuable during the chaotic final days of the Reich. There were no mattresses, few blankets, and the sanitation facilities, designed for a smaller male complement, were woefully inadequate for the numbers now confined there. Food was scarce. The British were still operating on field rations, and the local German infrastructure had completely collapsed. The women received the same rations as male POWs, approximately 1,500 calories per day, barely sufficient for survival. But the physical deprivation was perhaps less traumatic than the psychological state of the prisoners. These women had spent years immersed in Nazi propaganda that painted the British as ruthless imperialists who would show no mercy to defeated Germans. The propaganda had been particularly lurid regarding the fate that awaited German women who fell into enemy hands. Dr. Goebbels' ministry had circulated stories entirely fabricated of mass atrocities committed by Allied forces designed to stiffen resistance by making surrender seem worse than death. Sergeant William Bill Morrison of the Durham Light Infantry, a coal miner from County Durham before the war, was among the first British soldiers assigned to guard duty at the women's camp. A man of 32 with a wife and 2 daughters back in Seam, Morrison was struck immediately by the terror he witnessed. "They looked at us like we were monsters," he would later tell his family. "Some of them were just girls, really, no older than our Peggy would be now, and they were absolutely petrified. When we did the first roll call, half of them were shaking so badly they could barely stand. A few had clearly soiled themselves from fear. It was pitiful, really. Here we were, the victors, and I felt nothing but sorry for them." The initial days of the camp's operation were marked by mutual incomprehension and deep suspicion. The German women, expecting brutality, interpreted every British action through the lens of their propaganda-induced fears. When guards approached to conduct counts, women would press themselves against the walls of the huts. When orders were given, even simple instructions about meal times or sanitation, they were met with terrified compliance that suggested the women expected punishment for the slightest infraction. The British guards and administrators, for their part, were deeply uncomfortable with the situation. These were men who had been trained to fight soldiers, not to manage frightened women. Many of them had wives, sisters, and daughters at home. The cognitive dissonance of seeing women in enemy uniforms, women who had served the regime they had fought to destroy, yet who were clearly vulnerable and afraid, created a moral complexity that no amount of military training had prepared them for. Lieutenant Colonel Hartley recognized that the situation was untenable. In a report to his superiors at 21st Army Group Headquarters dated 28 April 1945, he wrote, "The current conditions at the women's detention facility are barely adequate and risk creating a humanitarian crisis that would reflect poorly on British military government. These women, regardless of their service to the enemy, are now our responsibility. We must either treat them in accordance with civilized standards or risk undermining the very principles for which we fought this war." The response from headquarters was bureaucratic and unhelpful, followed Geneva Convention guidelines as applicable, maintained security, and await further instructions. In the absence of clear direction, Hartley convened a meeting with his senior NCOs, sergeants and warrant officers, who would actually have to implement whatever policies were decided upon. It was at this meeting, held in a requisitioned German schoolhouse on the evening of 29 April 1945, that the seeds of what would become a remarkable act of compassion were planted. Present were Sergeant Morrison, Sergeant Thomas "Tommy" Fletcher of the Royal Army Service Corps, a lorry driver from Manchester who was responsible for logistics, and Sergeant Major Arthur Pemberton of the Military Police, a career soldier from London who had served in India before the war. "The problem, as I see it," Pemberton began, speaking with the authority of his rank and experience, "is that these women are living in conditions that would shame us if they became known. They've been wearing the same clothes for weeks. The sanitation is appalling, and they're so frightened of us that they won't even ask for help when they need it." Fletcher, a practical man who had spent the war ensuring that supplies reached where they were needed, added his perspective. "We've got warehouses full of captured German supplies, uniforms, blankets, medical stores, and we've been receiving Red Cross parcels that were meant for our lads in POW camps, never got distributed. There's no reason these women should be living in filth when we've got the means to improve their situation." Morrison, the youngest of the three but perhaps the most emotionally affected by what he had witnessed, spoke with quiet intensity. "My Peggy is 17. If she were in their place, if Britain had lost and she'd been captured, I'd want to think that whoever had charge of her would treat her decently. These women served Hitler, aye, but they're somebody's daughters, somebody's sisters. We've won the war. We can afford to be decent." Yeah. The discussion continued for over an hour, ranging across practical concerns, security, resources, potential criticism from higher command, and moral questions, whether compassion towards former enemies was appropriate, whether it might be seen as weakness. In the end, a consensus emerged that reflected a peculiarly British sensibility. Regardless of who these women had been or what they had done, they were now prisoners under British care, and British standards of decency demanded that they be treated humanely. Hartley, listening to his NCOs, made a decision that would have profound consequences. "Right," he said in the clipped tones of command. "Sergeant Fletcher, inventory what supplies we have available. Clothing, soap, medical supplies, anything that might improve conditions. Sergeant Major Pemberton, work out the security implications of allowing the women access to washing facilities and clean clothes. Sergeant Morrison, you'll be in charge of the actual distribution. Make it clear to the women that this is not a reward, but simply what they're entitled to as prisoners under our care. We'll begin tomorrow." As the meeting broke up and the men filed out into the cool German evening, none of them fully appreciated the significance of what they had just decided. They were simply doing what seemed right, what seemed, in their minds, to be the British thing to do. But for the women in the barracks, what was about to happen would challenge everything they had been taught to believe about their enemies and about themselves. The stage was set for an encounter that would reveal the power of simple human decency to transcend the hatreds of war, and demonstrate that even in the midst of total victory, the true measure of a nation lies not in how it treats its friends, but in how it treats those who have no power to demand anything at all. The morning of 30th April 1945 dawned gray and drizzly over Lüneburg, the sort of weather that seemed to match the mood of a continent exhausted by 6 years of war. In Berlin, some 200 miles to the southeast, Adolf Hitler was spending his final hours in the Führerbunker, though news of his impending suicide would not reach the British forces for another 2 days. In the makeshift women's detention camp on the outskirts of Lüneburg, the day began like any other, with fear, hunger, and the grinding uncertainty of captivity. Sergeant Bill Morrison arrived at the camp at Zorus 700 hours, accompanied by Sergeant Tommy Fletcher and a detail of 6 soldiers from the Durham Light Infantry. They brought with them 3 lorries loaded with supplies that Fletcher had spent the previous evening gathering from various British stores and captured German warehouses. The cargo included 400 sets of clean German women's auxiliary uniforms found in a Wehrmacht supply depot, 200 bars of British Army issue soap, 150 towels, a mixture of British and German origin, several crates of Red Cross parcels containing toiletries, and, perhaps most significantly, a dozen large containers of DDT powder for delousing. The plan was straightforward in concept but fraught with potential complications in execution. The women would be organized into groups of 20, escorted to the camp's washing facilities, which had been cleaned and prepared the previous evening, allowed to bathe and delouse themselves under supervision, and then issued clean clothing. The entire operation was expected to take 2 days, given the numbers involved and the limited facilities available. What Morrison and his colleagues had not fully anticipated was the depth of fear and suspicion that their arrival would trigger. When the lorries pulled up outside the main barracks and the British soldiers began unloading the supplies, the women inside watched through the windows with expressions of terror. They had seen lorries arrive before, bringing meager food rations or additional prisoners. But this was different. The soldiers were carrying bundles of clothing, boxes of supplies, and speaking to each other with an air of purpose that suggested something significant was about to happen. Frau Margarete Schneider, a 34-year-old former signals auxiliary from Hamburg, would later describe the scene in testimony given to German researchers in the 1970s. We had no idea what was happening. We saw the British soldiers unloading things from the trucks, and we thought, well, we didn't know what to think. Some of the younger girls were convinced they were going to separate us, take us away in groups. There were rumors that the British were sending German women to work camps in England, or that they were going to hand us over to the Russians. The fear was indescribable. When Sergeant Morrison entered the first barracks, Hut 7, which housed 43 women, the reaction was immediate and visceral. The women who had been standing or sitting on the bare wooden bunks immediately pressed themselves against the walls, far from the door as possible. Several of the younger women began to cry. One woman, later identified as Helga Richter, a 20-year-old from Dresden, fainted and had to be caught by her companions. Morrison, a man not given to eloquent speeches, found himself profoundly affected by the scene. Here were women, some barely more than girls, looking at him with the same terror he had seen in the eyes of wounded soldiers awaiting amputation. He stood in the doorway for a moment, acutely aware that every movement he made was being interpreted through the lens of their fear. Right then, he began, speaking slowly in his Durham accent, with Private David Cohen, a Jewish refugee from Berlin who had fled to England in 1938 and now served as an interpreter, translating his words into German. I know you're frightened. I know you've been told stories about what we British would do if we captured you. But I'm here to tell you that those stories were lies. He paused, allowing Cohen to translate, watching the women's faces for any sign of comprehension or belief. He saw none, only continued fear and suspicion. We've brought clean clothes, soap, and towels, Morrison continued. You're going to be taken in groups to the washing facilities. You'll be able to bathe properly with hot water. You'll be given clean uniforms and undergarments. This isn't a trick. This isn't a punishment. This is just what's right. The translation hung in the air. The women remained frozen, pressed against the walls. Morrison could see that his words, however well-intentioned, were simply not penetrating the barrier of fear that Nazi propaganda had erected in their minds. It was Sergeant Major Pemberton, standing behind Morrison, who made the breakthrough. Pemberton, who had daughters of his own and had spent years in India learning to navigate cultural differences, stepped forward and addressed the women directly, waiting for Cohen to translate each sentence. I understand you're afraid, he said, his voice firm, but not unkind. You've been taught that we're monsters. But look at me. I'm a father. I have 2 daughters back in England, about the same age as some of you. If my girls were in your position, if they were prisoners, frightened and dirty, I would hope that whoever had charge of them would treat them with decency. That's all we're offering you. Decency. Nothing more, nothing less. There was a long silence. Then, from the back of the group, an older woman, Oberhelferin, senior auxiliary, Kata Zimmerman, aged 41, who had served as a supervisor in the Signals Corps, spoke up in heavily accented but comprehensible English. You're saying we can wash? With soap? And we will have clean clothes? Yes, Pemberton replied simply. And then what happens to us? Zimmerman asked, her voice shaking slightly. After we are clean? Then you go back to your barracks, Pemberton said. That's all. We're not taking you away. We're not separating you. We're just giving you the chance to be clean and have decent clothes. That's all this is. Zimmerman translated this exchange for the other women in rapid German. Morrison watched as the information spread through the group, seeing the women's expressions shift from terror to confusion to something that might have been cautious hope. I will go first, Zimmerman announced, stepping forward with visible effort. If this is a trick, better that it happens to me than to the younger ones. Her courage, for it was courage, Morrison realized, to step forward when you believed you might be walking into a trap, broke the paralysis. Slowly, 19 other women volunteered to form the first group. They were escorted out of the barracks by Morrison and 2 other soldiers, walking in a tight cluster, still visibly frightened, but no longer cowering. The washing facilities, a concrete building that had once served as the barracks bathhouse, had been prepared, as well as circumstances allowed. The British had managed to get the boilers working, providing hot water for the first time in weeks. The building had been divided by hanging blankets to create private areas, and 2 female German nurses who had been captured with a field hospital and were considered trustworthy had been brought in to assist and provide a female presence that might ease the women's fears. What happened next was described by Private Cohen, who remained outside the facility but could hear what transpired in a letter to his sister in London. When the women realized that the hot water was real, that the soap was real, that they were actually being allowed to wash properly for the first time in weeks, the sound that came from that building was like nothing I'd ever heard. It started with one woman, and then it spread. They were crying, Sarah. Not crying from fear or pain, but from relief, from the simple human relief of being clean. The first group took nearly 2 hours to complete the process. They bathed, doused themselves with the DDT powder, a humiliating but necessary procedure that the German nurses helped to make as dignified as possible, and were issued clean uniforms. When they emerged from the facility, they looked like different people. The grime and lice that had been their constant companions were gone. They wore clean clothes that fit properly, and their expressions had changed. The terror had not entirely disappeared, but it had been joined by something else, a tentative, fragile sense that perhaps they were not going to be brutalized after all. But it was when they returned to their barracks that the full emotional impact of what had happened became apparent. The women who had been bathed and given clean clothes were immediately surrounded by those who had not yet had their turn. Questions flew in rapid German. Was it real? Did they hurt you? What happened? And as the first group tried to explain, tried to convey that the British had simply allowed them to wash and given them clean clothes, nothing more, the emotional dam that had been holding back weeks of accumulated fear and stress finally broke. Frau Schneider, the Hamburg Signals Auxiliary, described the scene. When Käthe and the others came back, clean and wearing proper uniforms, we couldn't believe it. We had been living in filth for so long, wearing the same clothes day after day, that we had almost forgotten what it felt like to be clean. And when they told us that the British had been kind, that they had been treated with respect, that's when I started to cry. Not just me, all of us. Because we realized that everything we had been told was a lie. The British weren't monsters. They were just men, doing what they thought was right. And that made us realize how completely we had been deceived by our own leaders. The process continued throughout the day and into the next. Group after group of women were escorted to the washing facilities, bathed, deloused, and given clean clothes. With each group, the fear diminished slightly, replaced by a growing sense of disbelief and gratitude. The British soldiers, for their part, maintained a professional demeanor, but many of them were deeply moved by what they were witnessing. Sergeant Fletcher, the Manchester lorry driver who had organized the logistics of the operation, wrote in his diary that evening, "Today we gave some German women soap and clean clothes. That's all. You'd have thought we'd given them the world." It makes you think about what war does to people. When something as simple as being clean becomes a gift beyond measure. We've won this war, and we've every right to be proud of that. But I think we can also be proud of this, that we didn't let victory turn us into the monsters they were told we were. Yet the operation was not without its challenges and complications. Not all the women responded with gratitude. Some remained deeply suspicious, convinced that this kindness was merely a prelude to some greater cruelty. A few refused to participate, preferring to remain in their filthy state rather than risk whatever trap they believed was being set. The British did not force them. Morrison's instructions were clear that participation was voluntary, though strongly encouraged. There were also practical difficulties. The washing facilities, even with the boilers working, could not provide enough hot water for all 347 women in a short period. Some groups had to make do with lukewarm water. The supply of clean uniforms, while adequate, was not perfect. Some women received uniforms that fit poorly, and there were not enough undergarments to provide fresh ones for everyone. The DDT delousing, while effective, was unpleasant and left some women with skin irritation. Moreover, the operation took place against a backdrop of continued chaos and uncertainty. News was filtering through of the final collapse of German resistance, of the discovery of concentration camps by Allied forces, of the full horror of what the Nazi regime had perpetrated. Some of the British soldiers, learning of these atrocities, questioned whether German women who had served the regime deserved any kindness at all. Private James Thornton, a young soldier from Liverpool, expressed this sentiment in a letter home. "We're being told to treat these German women decently, to give them soap and clean clothes, while at the same time we're hearing about what they did at Belsen and Buchenwald. It doesn't sit right, Mum. These women served Hitler. They were part of the machine that did those terrible things. Why should we care if they're clean or dirty?" It was Sergeant Major Pemberton who addressed this concern in a brief talk to the soldiers under his command. "What we're doing here isn't about what they deserve," he said. "It's about who we are. We're British. We don't abuse prisoners. We don't let people under our care live in filth. Not because they've earned it, but because that's not who we are. The Nazis treated people like animals. We won't. That's the difference between us and them. That's why we won." This philosophy, that treating prisoners decently was not about rewarding them, but about maintaining British standards of conduct, became the guiding principle of the operation. It reflected a deeply ingrained cultural value, the belief that there were certain standards of behavior that defined what it meant to be British, and that these standards applied regardless of circumstances or the identity of those involved. By the evening of 1st May 1945, the operation was complete. All 347 women in the camp had been given the opportunity to bathe and receive clean clothes. The camp, while still a detention facility surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, had been transformed from a place of squalor and terror into something more closely resembling a proper prisoner-of-war facility. The impact on the women was profound and lasting. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the camp changed noticeably. The women were still prisoners, still uncertain about their future, still grieving for the destruction of their country. But the paralyzing fear that had characterized the first days of their captivity had been replaced by something more complex, a grudging respect for their captors, a growing awareness of the lies they had been told, and the beginning of a psychological process that would eventually allow them to confront the reality of what the regime they had served had actually done. For the British soldiers involved, the operation was a reminder that even in the midst of total war, there were moments when simple human decency could make a profound difference. They had not ended the war or liberated a city or won a great battle. They had simply given some frightened women soap and clean clothes, but in doing so, they had demonstrated something fundamental about the values for which they had fought, and about the kind of peace they hoped to build from the ruins of war. The transformation at the Lüneburg women's detention camp did not go unnoticed. Within days, word of the British treatment of their female prisoners began to spread through the chaotic landscape of defeated Germany, carried by released prisoners, German civilians working for the British military government, and the informal networks of communication that spring up in any occupied territory. The reaction among the remaining German military and civilian population was one of profound confusion and disbelief. For 12 years, the Nazi propaganda machine had constructed an elaborate narrative about the nature of Germany's enemies. The British in particular had been portrayed as decadent imperialists whose veneer of civilization masked a ruthless determination to destroy Germany and enslave its people. The propaganda had been especially lurid regarding what would happen to German women who fell into British hands. Stories of mass rape, forced labor, and systematic humiliation had been circulated widely, designed to stiffen resistance by making surrender seem worse than death. Now, those stories were colliding with a very different reality. German women who had been held by the British were reporting not brutality, but unexpected kindness. They spoke of being given soap and clean clothes, of being treated with a respect that seemed incomprehensible given the circumstances. For a population that had been thoroughly indoctrinated in Nazi ideology, this created a cognitive dissonance that was deeply unsettling. Oberst Colonel Heinrich Müller, a Wehrmacht officer who had surrendered to British forces near Hamburg and was being held in a separate POW facility, encountered this phenomenon firsthand when he was briefly reunited with his sister, Greta, who had served as a signals auxiliary and had been held at Lüneburg. The meeting, arranged by British authorities as part of their policy of allowing family contacts where possible, took place in early May 1945. I expected to find Greta traumatized, possibly injured, Miller would later write in his memoirs, published in Germany in 1968. Instead, I found her clean, adequately fed, and, most surprisingly, speaking of her British captors with something approaching respect. She told me about the soap and the clean clothes, about how the British sergeants had treated her and the other women with a courtesy that seemed almost absurd given the circumstances. I didn't believe her at first. I thought perhaps she was in shock, or that she was afraid to tell me the truth. But as she continued to speak, I realized that she was telling me exactly what had happened, and I didn't know what to make of it. This confusion was not limited to individual Germans. At higher levels of the collapsing German command structure, reports of British treatment of female prisoners created a crisis of understanding. German officers who had spent years fighting the British, who had been trained to see them as implacable enemies, found themselves confronting evidence that contradicted everything they had been taught. Major General Kurt Dittmar, who had served as a military commentator for German radio throughout the war and was considered one of the more realistic and less ideologically driven German officers, was captured by British forces in early May. During his interrogation by British intelligence officers, he was shown reports of conditions in various POW facilities, including the women's camp at Lüneburg. His response, recorded in the interrogation transcripts now held in the National Archives at Kew, was revealing. "I find this very difficult to understand," Dittmar said, speaking through an interpreter. "We were told that the British would be ruthless in victory, that they would seek revenge for the bombing of their cities and the years of war. Instead, you are treating our women, who served the Wehrmacht and therefore served the regime you fought to destroy, with a consideration that seems almost gentlemanly. This is not how we were taught to expect you to behave." The British interrogator, Captain Michael Hartley, no relation to Lieutenant Colonel James Hartley, responded with a statement that captured the British perspective. "We're not being gentlemanly, General. We're being British. There's a difference. We don't abuse prisoners because that's not who we are. Not because we're trying to be chivalrous. Your propaganda told your people that we were barbarians. We're simply proving that we're not." This exchange highlighted a fundamental misunderstanding that had characterized German perceptions of the British throughout the war. The Nazi regime had projected its own brutality onto its enemies, assuming that the British would behave as the Germans themselves had behaved in occupied territories. The reality that the British maintained certain standards of conduct, even towards defeated enemies, was so foreign to Nazi ideology that it seemed almost incomprehensible. The confusion extended to German civilians as well. In the towns and villages around Lüneburg, rumors about the women's camp spread rapidly. Some Germans, still clinging to Nazi beliefs, insisted that the stories of British kindness must be Allied propaganda designed to encourage surrender. Others, particularly those who had begun to doubt the regime even before its collapse, saw the British treatment of prisoners as evidence that they had been lied to about everything. Frau Elisabeth Hartmann, a schoolteacher from Lüneburg, who had lost her husband on the Eastern Front, recorded her thoughts in a diary that was later donated to the Hamburg Museum of History. "We are hearing stories that the British are treating our women prisoners with decency, giving them clean clothes and proper food. If this is true, and I am beginning to believe it is, then what else have we been lied to about? We were told the British were monsters. We were told they would destroy Germany utterly. But if they are capable of showing kindness to women who served against them, then perhaps everything we were told was false." It is a terrifying thought, because if we were lied to about this, what about everything else? What about the Jews? What about the camps we are now hearing about? I am afraid to think about what the truth might be. This psychological crisis, the shattering of certainties that had been held for years, was precisely what British military government officials had hoped to achieve, though they had not planned it in quite this way. The policy of treating German prisoners, including women, with basic decency was not primarily motivated by humanitarian concerns, though those played a role, but by a calculated understanding that the post-war occupation would be far easier if the German population could be convinced that the Allies were not the monsters Nazi propaganda had portrayed. Brigadier John Ashworth, who served as the senior civil affairs officer for the British zone in northern Germany, articulated this strategy in a report to 21st Army Group Headquarters dated 15 May 1945. The treatment of German POWs, particularly female prisoners, has proven to be an unexpectedly effective tool in undermining residual Nazi ideology. By demonstrating that British forces adhere to civilized standards of conduct even towards former enemies, we are creating a cognitive dissonance that forces Germans to question everything they were told by the Nazi regime. This is not sentimentality, it is sound policy. A population that respects its occupiers is far easier to govern than one that fears and hates them. Yet not all British personnel agreed with this approach. There were those who felt that any kindness shown to Germans, particularly those who had served the Nazi regime, was misplaced and potentially dangerous. These critics argued that the German people needed to be made to feel the full weight of their defeat, that leniency would be interpreted as weakness, and that the horrors being discovered in the concentration camps demanded a harsher response. Major Geoffrey Winters, an intelligence officer who had been involved in the liberation of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp just weeks earlier, expressed this view in a heated exchange with Lieutenant Colonel Hartley. "We're giving soap and clean clothes to women who served Hitler, while the victims of Belsen are still dying by the hundreds. Does that seem right to you?" These women were part of the machine that made the camps possible. They don't deserve our kindness. Hartley's response, recorded in his memoirs, reflected the tension between justice and pragmatism that characterized British policy in those chaotic weeks. "I don't disagree with your anger, Geoffrey. God knows, after what we saw at Belsen, I understand it. But we're not giving these women soap because they deserve it. We're doing it because we need to show the German people that there's a different way to behave, that civilization doesn't have to collapse into barbarism. If we treat prisoners the way the Nazis treated theirs, we become what we fought against, and we lose any moral authority to rebuild this country into something better." This debate between those who advocated for strict justice and those who argued for pragmatic mercy would continue throughout the occupation period. But in the specific case of the women's camp at Lüneburg, the policy of decent treatment had already been implemented, and its effects were rippling outward in ways that no one had fully anticipated. Among the German women themselves, the realization that they had been lied to about the British created a profound psychological shift. Many of them began for the first time to question other aspects of Nazi propaganda. If they had been wrong about the British, what else might they have been wrong about? This questioning was painful and often resisted. It is never easy to admit that one has been deceived, especially when that deception has shaped years of one's life. Helga Richter, the young woman from Dresden who had fainted when the British first entered her barracks, described this process in an interview conducted in the 1980s. "When the British gave us soap and clean clothes, it was like a crack appeared in a wall I didn't even know was there. Everything I had been taught said that the British would be cruel, that they would humiliate us and abuse us, but they didn't. They were kind. And once I started to question that one thing, I couldn't stop questioning everything else. It was terrifying, because my whole world had been built on what I now realized were lies, but it was also liberating in a strange way. It meant that maybe there was hope for something better." This psychological transformation was not universal or immediate. Some of the women clung to their Nazi beliefs, interpreting British kindness as weakness or as a cynical ploy. Others were so traumatized by the collapse of their world that they retreated into denial, refusing to engage with the implications of what had happened. But for a significant number, the simple act of being treated with basic human decency by their former enemies became the catalyst for a fundamental re-evaluation of everything they had believed. The impact extended beyond the camp itself. As word spread of British treatment of prisoners, the rate of German surrender increased noticeably. Wehrmacht units that might have continued fighting, motivated by fear of what would happen if they were captured, instead chose to surrender to British forces rather than risk capture by the Soviets, whose treatment of German prisoners was, by all accounts, far harsher. Civilian resistance to the occupation, which British planners had feared might be significant, largely failed to materialize in areas where the British reputation for fair treatment had spread. By mid-May 1945, with the war in Europe officially over, the women's camp at Lüneburg had become something of a model for British POW policy. Other camps were instructed to follow similar procedures, ensuring that prisoners, male and female, were provided with adequate sanitation, clean clothing, and basic medical care. The policy was not always perfectly implemented. Resources were limited, and some British personnel were less committed to the approach than others. But the principle had been established. British forces would treat prisoners in accordance with civilized standards, regardless of what those prisoners had done or what regime they had served. The German reaction to this policy remained complex and often contradictory. There was gratitude, certainly, particularly among those who had directly benefited from British kindness. But there was also shame. The shame of realizing that one's enemies had proven more honorable than one's own leaders. And there was confusion as Germans struggled to reconcile the reality of British behavior with years of propaganda that had painted a very different picture. Oberst Miller, reflecting on his conversation with his sister Greta, captured this confusion in his memoirs. The British had every reason to hate us. We had bombed their cities, killed their soldiers, fought them for 6 years. And yet, when they had us at their mercy, they chose decency over vengeance. I don't know if I would have done the same in their position. I'd like to think I would have, but I honestly don't know. And that uncertainty, that realization that perhaps we Germans were not the superior people we had been taught we were, was more devastating than any military defeat could have been. This shattering of certainties, this forced confrontation with uncomfortable truths, was perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the British policy of decent treatment. It created the psychological space necessary for Germans to begin the difficult process of coming to terms with what their nation had done and to start imagining a different kind of future. It would be years, decades even, before that process was complete, and it would never be entirely successful. But it began in part with something as simple as British sergeants offering soap and clean clothes to frightened women in a detention camp in Lüneburg, and in doing so proving that the propaganda had been lies. The relative calm that had settled over the Lüneburg women's detention camp in the days following the distribution of clean clothes and the establishment of proper sanitation was shattered on the morning of 18th May 1945. The crisis came not from within the camp itself, but from the chaotic situation that still prevailed across defeated Germany, and it would test the British commitment to decent treatment in ways that no one had anticipated. The problem began with numbers. In the 3 weeks since the camp had been established, the population had grown from the original 347 women to over 600. British forces, as they swept through northern Germany and processed the millions of displaced persons, refugees, and former military personnel, continued to send female prisoners to Lüneburg. The camp, designed and supplied for roughly 350 inmates, was now desperately overcrowded. The washing facilities that had been adequate for the original population were now overwhelmed. Food supplies, already stretched thin, were running critically low, and the sanitation system, barely adequate to begin with, was on the verge of complete failure. Lieutenant Colonel Hartley, surveying the situation on the morning of 18th of May, recognized that he was facing a potential humanitarian disaster. In a terse message to 21st Army Group Headquarters, he wrote, "Camp population now, 612 and rising, facilities inadequate, sanitation failing, food supplies critical. Request immediate assistance or authorization to transfer excess prisoners to other facilities. Current situation unsustainable and risks outbreak of disease." The response from headquarters was not encouraging. Every British POW facility in northern Germany was facing similar overcrowding. The sheer scale of the German collapse, millions of soldiers surrendering, millions more civilians displaced, had overwhelmed the capacity of the British military government to process and house them all. There were no other facilities available to take the excess women from Lüneburg. Additional supplies were promised, but with the transportation network still disrupted and priorities focused on feeding the civilian population and dealing with the concentration camp survivors, there was no clear timeline for when those supplies might arrive. Hartley convened an emergency meeting with his senior NCOs on the evening of 18th of May. Present were Sergeant Morrison, Sergeant Fletcher, Sergeant Major Pemberton, and several other key personnel. The mood was grim. "We're looking at a complete breakdown," Hartley said bluntly. "The sanitation system is failing. We've got women sleeping on the floors because there aren't enough bunks. The washing facilities can't handle the demand. And we're down to half rations because we simply don't have enough food. If we don't do something, we're going to have disease, possibly dysentery or typhus, and if that happens, we'll have deaths on our hands." The discussion that followed was intense and wide-ranging. Various solutions were proposed and rejected. Could reduce rations further, but the women were already on the edge of malnutrition. They could halt the washing program to conserve resources, but that would risk the very disease outbreak they were trying to prevent. They could request that no more prisoners be sent to Lüneburg, but that would simply shift the problem elsewhere without solving it. It was Sergeant Fletcher, the logistics specialist from Manchester, who proposed the solution that would ultimately be adopted. "We need to expand the camp," he said. "There's a German barracks complex about 2 miles from here, used to house Luftwaffe personnel. It was damaged in the fighting, but the structures are basically sound. If we can get a work detail together, we could make it habitable in a week, maybe less. That would give us the space we need." "And who's going to do this work?" Pemberton asked. "We don't have the manpower to spare. Every able-bodied soldier we have is already assigned to essential duties." Fletcher paused, then said what everyone in the room had been thinking, but no one had wanted to voice. "Women themselves. We organize them into work parties, provide them with tools and materials, and have them repair the barracks under our supervision." The suggestion was met with immediate objections. Having prisoners perform labor for their captors was a sensitive issue, fraught with legal and moral complications. The Geneva Convention allowed for prisoner labor under certain conditions, but the line between legitimate work and exploitation was not always clear. Moreover, there was the question of whether the women, many of whom were still physically weak from weeks of poor nutrition, were capable of the heavy labor that would be required. But as the discussion continued, it became clear that there were no good alternatives. Camp was overcrowded, supplies were inadequate, and help from higher command was not forthcoming. If they did nothing, people would die. If they organized the women to help improve their own living conditions, they might, just might, avert disaster. Hartley made the decision. "We'll do it, but we'll do it properly. Participation will be voluntary. No one will be forced to work. Those who do work will receive extra rations. The work will be supervised to ensure safety, and we'll make it clear that this is about improving their conditions, not about exploiting them. Sergeant Fletcher, you'll organize the logistics. Sergeant Morrison, you'll handle the recruitment and supervision. We start tomorrow." The next morning, Morrison and Private Cohen entered the main barracks to explain the situation to the women. Morrison had spent the previous evening thinking about how to present the proposal in a way that would not be seen as coercion or exploitation. He knew that trust, while growing, was still fragile. "Ladies," he began, with Cohen translating, "I'm going to be honest with you about our situation. This camp is overcrowded. We don't have enough space, enough food, or enough facilities for everyone. We've asked for help from our headquarters, but they don't have the resources to give us. So we need to help ourselves." He paused, watching the women's faces, seeing the wariness return. "There's another barracks complex nearby that we can use, but it needs repairs. We need people to help with that work, cleaning, basic repairs, moving supplies. If you volunteer to help, you'll receive extra food rations, and you'll be improving your own living conditions. But I want to be clear. This is voluntary. No one will be punished for refusing, and the work will be supervised to make sure it's safe." The response was not what Morrison had expected. Instead of reluctance or resentment, he saw something else in the women's faces, a kind of relief. After weeks of enforced idleness, of sitting in overcrowded barracks with nothing to do but worry about the future, the prospect of useful work that would tangibly improve their situation, was actually appealing. Kata Zimmerman, the former Oberhelferin who had been the first to volunteer for the washing program, spoke up. "How many volunteers do you need?" "As many as are willing and able," Morrison replied. "But I'd say we need at least 100 to get the work done in a reasonable time." Zimmerman turned to the other women and spoke rapidly in German. A discussion broke out, voices overlapping. Then Zimmerman turned back to Morrison. "We will help," she said simply, "not because we are forced to, but because it is in our interest to do so, and because—" He paused, searching for the right words in English. "Because you have treated us fairly. We will return that fairness with our labor." By the end of the day, 127 women had volunteered for the work detail. They ranged in age from 19 to 43, and included former signals operators, administrative staff, and even a few who had served in anti-aircraft batteries. Sergeant Fletcher organized them into teams based on their physical capabilities and the tasks that needed to be done. The stronger women would handle the heavy work, moving debris, carrying supplies. Others would do cleaning, painting, and basic repairs. A few with medical training would serve as a safety detail, ready to provide first aid if needed. The work began on 20th of May and continued for the next 10 days. Each morning, the volunteer work parties would march the 2 miles to the damaged barracks complex, escorted by British soldiers. They would work for 6 hours, with regular breaks and access to water and food. Then they would march back to the main camp. The work was hard, harder than many of the women had ever done, but it was also purposeful. They were building something, improving their own situation through their own efforts. The transformation was remarkable. The damaged barracks, which had been little more than shells when the work began, gradually became habitable. Broken windows were repaired or boarded up. Debris was cleared. The plumbing was fixed. Walls were cleaned and painted. Bunks were constructed from salvaged materials. By the end of May, the new facility was ready to house 250 additional women, significantly easing the overcrowding at the main camp. But the impact of the work program went far beyond the physical improvements. For the women involved, the experience of working alongside their former enemies, of being trusted with tools and given responsibility, of seeing the tangible results of their labor, was profoundly transformative. It gave them a sense of agency that they had lacked since their capture. It demonstrated that the British saw them not just as prisoners to be guarded, but as human beings capable of contributing to their own welfare. Frau Schneider, the signals auxiliary from Hamburg, described the experience in her later testimony. "Working on the barracks was the first time since the surrender that I felt like a person again, not just a prisoner." The British sergeants treated us with respect, listened to our suggestions about how to organize the work, and trusted us to do the job properly. It sounds strange, but I was actually proud of what we accomplished. We took a ruin and made it into a place where people could live with dignity, and we did it together, German women and British soldiers working towards the same goal. The work program was not without its challenges. There were minor injuries, cuts, bruises, one sprained ankle. Some of the women, weakened by weeks of poor nutrition, found the work too demanding and had to stop. There were also tensions. A few of the women who had not volunteered resented those who had, accusing them of collaborating with the enemy, and some British soldiers questioned whether it was appropriate to have former enemy personnel working on projects that benefited the occupation forces. But these challenges were manageable, and the overall success of the program led to its expansion. Other work details were organized to improve the main camp's facilities, to help with the distribution of supplies, and even to assist with administrative tasks. The women, given the opportunity to contribute, proved themselves capable and willing, and the British, seeing the positive results, became more confident in their policy of treating prisoners as partners in managing the camps rather than simply as inmates to be guarded. The crisis that had threatened to overwhelm the camp in mid-May had been averted, not through additional resources from higher command, which never materialized in sufficient quantities, but through improvisation, cooperation, and a willingness on both sides to work together towards a common goal. It was a small-scale example of the kind of practical cooperation that would be necessary for the larger project of rebuilding Germany. and it demonstrated that such cooperation was possible even between former enemies. Sergeant Major Pemberton, reflecting on the experience in a letter to his wife, wrote, "We faced a crisis that could have turned into a disaster. We didn't have the resources to solve it on our own, and help wasn't coming. So we did what the British have always done best. We muddled through. We asked the German women to help us, and they did. Not because they had to, but because it was in everyone's interest. It's not the way wars are supposed to end, with enemies working together to fix a roof or repair a water pipe. But maybe that's exactly how wars should end, with people realizing that they have more in common than they thought, and that working together is better than fighting." The successful resolution of the crisis reinforced the British commitment to their policy of decent treatment. It demonstrated that treating prisoners with respect and involving them in decisions that affected their welfare was not just morally right, practically effective. It built trust, encouraged cooperation, and created the foundation for the kind of relationship between occupiers and occupied that would be necessary for long-term stability. By early June 1945, the Lüneburg Women's Detention Camp had evolved from a place of fear and squalor into something quite different, a functioning community where former enemies coexisted with a degree of mutual respect that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. The women were still prisoners, still uncertain about their future, still grieving for their defeated nation, but they were clean, adequately fed, and housed in decent conditions. And they had learned through direct experience that the British were capable of keeping their word and treating them fairly. This lesson, that decency and fair treatment were not signs of weakness but expressions of strength, would prove to be one of the most important legacies of the British occupation. It created the psychological foundation for the eventual reconciliation between Britain and Germany, and demonstrated that even in the aftermath of total war, it was possible to choose humanity over hatred. By mid-June 1945, the Lüneburg Women's Detention Camp had become something of an anomaly in the landscape of occupied Germany. While other POW facilities struggled with overcrowding, disease, and the sullen resentment of their inmates, Lüneburg had achieved a remarkable degree of stability and even cooperation. The camp now housed 623 women across 2 facilities, both adequately maintained. The women received regular rations, still meager by pre-war standards, but sufficient for health, had access to washing facilities, and were engaged in various work programs that gave them a sense of purpose and agency. But the relative calm of the camp existed in stark contrast to the revelations that were emerging across Germany about the true nature of the Nazi regime. Throughout May and June, as Allied forces liberated concentration camps and uncovered the full extent of the Holocaust, the German people, including the women at Lüneburg, were being forced to confront the horrific reality of what had been done in their name. The British military government, as part of its denazification program, had adopted a policy of forcing Germans to witness the evidence of Nazi atrocities. Civilians from nearby towns were marched through the liberated camps to see the piles of corpses and the emaciated survivors. Photographs and film footage of the camps were shown in makeshift cinemas, and former members of the German military, including the women at Lüneburg, were required to attend educational sessions where the evidence of Nazi crimes was presented in unflinching detail. On 15th of June 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Hartley announced that all women in the camp would be required to attend a screening of footage from Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, which had been liberated by British forces just 2 months earlier, less than 40 miles from Lüneburg. The announcement was met with a mixture of dread and denial. Many of the women had heard rumors about the camps, but the Nazi propaganda machine had dismissed these as Allied lies. Now they would be forced to see the truth. The screening took place in a large wooden building that had been converted into an assembly hall. The 623 women were seated on benches guarded by British soldiers. At the front of the hall, a projector had been set up, along with a screen. Lieutenant Colonel Hartley stood before them, his face grave. "What you are about to see," he said with Private Cohen translating, "is footage taken by British Army cameramen at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. I warn you that it is extremely disturbing, but it is necessary that you see it, because this is what was done by the regime you served. This is the truth that was hidden from you, and this is why we fought." The lights dimmed, and the footage began to play. What followed was 20 minutes of the most horrific images imaginable. Piles of skeletal corpses, survivors who looked more dead than alive, mass graves being filled with bulldozers, the walking skeletons of those who had somehow survived. The British cameramen had documented everything with unflinching clarity, creating a visual record that left no room for denial or rationalization. The reaction in the hall was immediate and visceral. Some women began to cry within the first few minutes. Others turned away, unable to watch. A few fainted and had to be carried out by the medical staff. Many sat in stunned silence, their faces frozen in expressions of horror and disbelief. And a very few, maintained expressions of defiant skepticism, refusing to accept what they were seeing. When the footage ended and the lights came back on, the hall was filled with the sound of weeping. Hartley stood before them again, his voice hard but not unkind. "This is what your leaders did," he said. "This is what the regime you served created. You may not have known about it. You may not have participated in it directly. But it was done in your name, by your countrymen, as part of the system you supported. You cannot undo it. You cannot make it right. But you can acknowledge it, and you can ensure that nothing like it ever happens again." The impact of the screening on the women was profound and varied. For some, it was the final shattering of any remaining loyalty to the Nazi regime. They had already begun to question the propaganda they had been fed, but seeing the evidence of the camps made denial impossible. These women experienced a psychological crisis as they struggled to reconcile their previous beliefs with the horrific reality they had just witnessed. Helga Richter, the young woman from Dresden, described her reaction in her later interview. "When I saw those images, I felt like my entire world collapsed. I had believed in the Führer, believed that we were fighting for something good and noble. And now I was seeing that we had been part of something monstrous. I couldn't stop crying. I cried for the people who had died in those camps. I cried for my own stupidity in believing the lies. And I cried because I didn't know how to live with the knowledge of what we had done." For others, the screening triggered a different response: anger. Not anger at the Allies for showing them the footage, but anger at their own leaders for deceiving them, for using them as tools in a system that had perpetrated such horrors. Ketha Zimmerman, the former Oberhelferin who had become an informal leader among the women, expressed this sentiment in a conversation with Sergeant Morrison a few days after the screening. "We were lied to," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "about everything, about the British, about the war, about what we were fighting for. They told us we were defending Germany, defending civilization, but we were defending this." She gestured towards the building where the screening had taken place. "How can we ever forgive ourselves? How can we ever forgive them?" Morrison, who had witnessed the liberation of Belsen himself and carried his own trauma from that experience, responded with surprising gentleness. "You can't forgive yourself, not really, not for something like this, but you can choose to be different. You can choose to build something better. That's all any of us can do." But not all the women responded with acceptance or remorse. A minority, perhaps 20 or 30 out of the 623, refused to believe what they had seen. They insisted that the footage was fabricated, that it was Allied propaganda designed to break German morale. They clung to their Nazi beliefs with a desperation that suggested they knew, on some level, that those beliefs were all they had left. These women became increasingly isolated within the camp, shunned by the majority who had accepted the truth. The British authorities, recognizing the psychological crisis that the screening had triggered, brought in additional medical and counseling staff to help the women process what they had seen. German doctors and nurses who had been vetted and cleared of Nazi affiliations were recruited to provide support. Religious services, both Protestant and Catholic, were organized for those who sought spiritual comfort, and the work programs were expanded, giving the women more opportunities to engage in productive activity that might help them cope with their psychological distress. The screening also marked a turning point in the relationship between the British Guards and the German prisoners. Before the screening, the British had treated the women with professional courtesy, but there had always been an emotional distance. These were former enemies, after all. After the screening, that distance began to close. The British soldiers, seeing the women's genuine horror and grief at what had been revealed, began to see them not as representatives of the Nazi regime, but as individuals who had been deceived and used by that regime. Sergeant Morrison described this shift in his diary. After they saw the Belsen footage, something changed. Before, I looked at these women and saw Germans, people who had served Hitler, who had been part of the machine that killed so many. But after I saw how they reacted to the truth, I started to see them differently. They weren't monsters. They were people who had been lied to, who had believed those lies, and who were now having to face the consequences. It doesn't excuse what was done. Nothing can excuse that. But it makes them human again in a way they weren't before. This humanization worked in both directions. The German women, seeing how the British soldiers responded to their distress, with sympathy rather than mockery, with support rather than condemnation, began to understand that their former enemies were not the monsters they had been taught to fear. The British were simply men doing a difficult job, trying to maintain order and decency in the chaos of defeated Germany. By late June, the psychological impact of the screening had begun to translate into observable changes in the camp's atmosphere. The women who had accepted the truth about the Nazi regime became more cooperative, more willing to engage with the British authorities, and more interested in learning about the democratic values that the Allies claimed to represent. Educational programs were organized, teaching basic civics, human rights, and the principles of democratic governance. These programs were voluntary, but attendance was high. The women were hungry for information, for a new framework to replace the ideology that had been shattered. The impact of the Lüneburg camp's transformation began to be felt beyond its barbed wire fences. Reports of the British approach to managing female prisoners, combining firm security with decent treatment and educational programs, reached higher levels of the Allied command structure. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, received a briefing on the Lüneburg model in late June and expressed approval of the approach. "This is how we win the peace," he reportedly said. "Not by grinding the Germans into the dirt, but by showing them that there's a better way to live." The success at Lüneburg also influenced British policy towards German POWs more broadly. Other camps began to adopt similar approaches, providing better sanitation, organizing work programs, and implementing educational initiatives designed to promote democratic values. The policy was not universally popular. There were still many in Britain and among the Allied forces who felt that Germans deserved harsher treatment, but it gradually became the standard approach in the British zone of occupation. For the women at Lüneburg, the weeks following the Belsen screening were a period of profound psychological transformation. They were coming to terms not just with the defeat of their nation, but with the realization that they had been complicit, however unwittingly, in a system of unprecedented evil. This reckoning was painful and ongoing. It would continue for years, for some, for the rest of their lives. But it was also necessary, the first step towards building a different kind of Germany. Frau Schneider, reflecting on this period, said, "The British could have treated us with cruelty. After what they showed us at Belsen, they would have been justified in doing so. They didn't. They continued to treat us with decency, even as they forced us to confront the truth about what our nation had done. That decency, that refusal to become what they had fought against, taught us more about democracy and human rights than any lecture could have. They showed us, through their actions, what it meant to be civilized, and that example stayed with us." By the end of June 1945, the Lüneburg women's detention camp had become a microcosm of the larger transformation that was beginning to take place across Germany. It was a place where former enemies were learning to coexist, where the lies of the past were being confronted, and where the possibility of a different future was beginning to emerge. The journey was far from complete. It would take years, even decades, for Germany to fully come to terms with its Nazi past. But the foundation was being laid, one act of decency at a time, in places like Lüneburg, where British sergeants had chosen compassion over vengeance, and where German women had found the courage to face the truth. The autumn of 1945 brought the first chill winds of what would become a long and difficult peace. By September, the immediate chaos of Germany's collapse had begun to give way to the grinding reality of occupation and reconstruction. The Lüneburg Women's Detention Camp, which had been established as a temporary facility in the desperate days of April, had evolved into something more permanent, a processing center where former members of the German Women's Auxiliaries were evaluated, denazified, and gradually released back into civilian life. The release process was methodical and bureaucratic, reflecting British thoroughness in all administrative matters. Each woman underwent a series of interviews designed to assess her level of involvement with the Nazi regime. Those who had held purely administrative or technical positions with no evidence of war crimes or significant Nazi party activity were released relatively quickly. Those with more problematic backgrounds, party members, those who had served in sensitive positions, or those suspected of involvement in atrocities, were held longer for more extensive investigation. By December 1945, the camp's population had dwindled to fewer than 200 women. The rest had been released, returning to a Germany that bore little resemblance to the nation they had known. Cities lay in ruins, the economy had collapsed, millions were homeless or displaced, and the country had been divided into occupation zones controlled by the four Allied powers. For women who had served the Nazi regime, reintegration into civilian life was fraught with challenges. They faced suspicion from their fellow Germans, struggled to find employment, and carried the psychological burden of their association with a regime now universally condemned. But for those who had been held at Lüneburg, there was something else as well, a memory of how they had been treated by their British captors, and a recognition that decency and humanity could survive even in the aftermath of total war. This memory would shape their lives and, in small but significant ways, contribute to the larger process of reconciliation between Britain and Germany. Lieutenant Colonel James Hartley, who had commanded the camp since its inception, was reassigned to other duties in January 1946. Before he left, he compiled a comprehensive report on the camp's operation, which was filed with the British military government and eventually found its way into the National Archives. The report's conclusion captured the essence of what had been achieved. The Lüneburg Women's Detention Facility began as an improvised response to an unexpected problem: what to do with several hundred German women who had served the enemy war machine. It evolved into a demonstration of British values in practice. By treating these women with basic human decency, providing clean clothes, adequate food, sanitation, and respect, we achieved several objectives. We maintained security without brutality. We began the process of denazification by confronting the women with the truth about the regime they had served, and we demonstrated to the German people that the British occupation would be governed by law and civilized standards, not by vengeance. The cost was minimal: some soap, some clean uniforms, and the willingness of British personnel to see their former enemies as human beings. The benefit was substantial, a model for how to manage the occupation in a way that promotes long-term stability and reconciliation. The sergeants who had been instrumental in implementing the camp's policies went on to varied post-war careers. Sergeant Bill Morrison returned to County Durham and resumed his work as a coal miner. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, but his family noted that he maintained a lifelong interest in German affairs and was a strong supporter of European reconciliation efforts. He died in 1978, and among his effects was a letter written in careful English from Kata Zimmerman, thanking him for his kindness during the darkest days of my life. Sergeant Tommy Fletcher, the logistics specialist from Manchester, remained in the Army after the war and eventually rose to the rank of major. He served in various postings around the world, but he always maintained that his most important work had been at Lüneburg. "We didn't win any medals for giving women soap and clean clothes," he told an interviewer in the 1960s. "But I think we did something more important than winning medals. We showed that you can be victorious, without being vicious. That's a lesson the world needs to remember. Sergeant Major Arthur Pemberton, the career soldier who had articulated the philosophy of decent treatment, retired from the Army in 1950 and became a teacher. He specialized in teaching history and civics, and he used his experiences at Lüneburg as a case study in his classes. "I tell my students," he wrote in a letter to a colleague, "that the true test of a nation's character is not how it treats its friends, but how it treats its enemies when it has the power to do anything it wants." Britain passed that test in 1945. I hope we never forget the lesson. For the German women who had been held at Lüneburg, the post-war years were difficult, but not without hope. Many of them struggled with poverty, social stigma, and the psychological trauma of their experiences. But they also carried with them the memory of how they had been treated by the British, and for many, this became a foundation for rebuilding their lives. Etta Zimmermann, the former Oberhelferin who had been the first to volunteer for the washing program and who had become an informal leader among the women, returned to her hometown of Bremen. She found work as a secretary and eventually became involved in local politics, serving on the city council in the 1950s. She was a strong advocate for women's rights and for reconciliation with Britain. In a speech given in 1965, on the 20th anniversary of the war's end, she said, "I served a regime that committed unspeakable crimes. I cannot change that, and I will carry the shame of it for the rest of my life. But I also experienced something else in those dark days of 1945. I experienced the kindness of enemies who had every reason to hate us, but who chose decency instead. The British sergeants who gave us soap and clean clothes, who treated us with respect when we deserved none, taught me more about human dignity than all the propaganda of the Third Reich. They showed me that it is possible to be strong without being cruel, to be victorious without being vengeful. That lesson has guided my life ever since." Helga Richter, the young woman from Dresden who had fainted when the British first entered her barracks, faced perhaps the most difficult post-war journey. Dresden had been devastated by Allied bombing, and she returned to find her family home destroyed and her parents dead. She struggled with depression and survivor's guilt for years, but she eventually found work as a nurse and dedicated her life to caring for others. In an interview conducted in the 1980s, she reflected on her time at Lüneburg. "When the British gave us clean clothes, I cried. Not just because I was clean for the first time in weeks, but because I realized that everything I had been taught was a lie. The British weren't monsters. They were decent people who treated us better than our own leaders had." That realization was devastating, but it was also liberating. It meant that there was hope for something better. It meant that humanity could survive even the worst that we could do to each other. Frau Margarete Schneider, the signals auxiliary from Hamburg, returned to her city to find it largely destroyed by Allied bombing. She worked for years in the reconstruction effort, eventually becoming a translator for the British occupation authorities. Her fluency in English and her understanding of British culture, gained in part from her experiences at Lüneburg, made her valuable in facilitating communication between the occupiers and the occupied. She married a British civil servant in 1950, a union that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier, and moved to England. She became a vocal advocate for British-German friendship and worked with various reconciliation organizations until her death in 1995. The impact of the Lüneburg camp extended beyond the individual women who had been held there. The British approach to managing female prisoners became a model that was studied and, to varying degrees, emulated by other Allied powers. The emphasis on decent treatment, combined with firm security and educational programs designed to promote democratic values, became a cornerstone of the occupation policy in the British zone. This policy contributed to the relatively successful denazification and democratization of West Germany. While the process was far from perfect, many former Nazis escaped justice, and the confrontation with Germany's past was often incomplete, the foundation was laid for the emergence of a stable democratic German state that would become a key ally of Britain and the other Western powers. The contrast with the Soviet zone, where occupation was characterized by harsh treatment, mass deportations, and the imposition of a communist dictatorship was stark. Germans who lived under British occupation, while they certainly faced hardships and restrictions, generally came to view the British as fair and even-handed. This perception facilitated cooperation and helped to create the conditions for eventual reconciliation. By the 1950s, as West Germany regained sovereignty and began its remarkable economic recovery, the memory of the immediate post-war period began to fade. But for those who had experienced it directly, both the British personnel who had served in the occupation forces and the Germans who had been under their control, the lessons remained vivid. In 1975, on the 30th anniversary of the war's end, a reunion was organized in Lüneburg. Former members of the British occupation forces and former inmates of the women's detention camp gathered to remember and reflect on their shared experiences. The event was covered by local media and attracted some attention in both Britain and Germany. At the reunion, Käthe Zimmermann, now in her 70s, gave a speech that captured the significance of what had happened 3 decades earlier. "We were enemies," she said, speaking in English with only a slight accent. "We had fought each other for 6 years. We had every reason to hate each other. But in the spring of 1945, in a detention camp in this town, something remarkable happened. British soldiers, who had every right to treat us harshly, chose instead to treat us with decency. They gave us soap and clean clothes. They gave us dignity when we had none. And in doing so, they gave us hope that a better future was possible. That hope was not misplaced. Look at us now, former enemies gathered as friends. This is the legacy of those British sergeants who chose compassion over vengeance. This is the legacy we must preserve and pass on to future generations." The reunion was attended by several of the British personnel who had served at the camp, including Bill Morrison, who made the journey from County Durham despite his advancing age. When asked by a reporter what he remembered most about his time at Lüneburg, Morrison replied simply, "I remember frightened women who thought we were going to hurt them, and I remember the look on their faces when they realized we weren't. That's what I remember. That's what mattered." The story of the Lüneburg women's detention camp, while not widely known outside of academic circles and local history, became part of the larger narrative of British-German reconciliation. It was cited in studies of post-war occupation policy, referenced in discussions of how to manage post-conflict situations, and used as an example of how decent treatment of former enemies can contribute to long-term peace and stability. In the decades that followed, as Britain and Germany became close allies within the European Union and NATO, the memory of 1945 served as a reminder of how far both nations had come. The generation that had experienced the war and its immediate aftermath gradually passed away, but they left behind a legacy of reconciliation built on the foundation of those early post-war encounters. The British sergeants who had offered soap and clean clothes to frightened German women in the spring of 1945 had not been trying to make history. They had simply been trying to do what seemed right to maintain the standards of decency that they believed defined what it meant to be British. But in doing so, they had contributed to something larger, the transformation of enemies into partners, the replacement of hatred with understanding, and the creation of a peace that would last for generations. As the 21st century dawned, the Lüneburg women's detention camp was long gone, its wooden barracks demolished decades earlier, but the lessons it taught remained relevant. In a world still plagued by conflict, where the treatment of prisoners and the conduct of occupying forces continue to be sources of controversy and moral challenge, the story of Lüneburg offers a simple but profound message: that decency costs little but achieves much, that treating even former enemies with respect is not weakness but strength, and that the choices made in the immediate aftermath of conflict can shape the peace for generations to come. The women who cowered when British sergeants entered their barracks in April 1945 and who sobbed when they were offered clean clothes had experienced firsthand the power of simple human kindness to transcend the hatreds of war. Their tears were not just tears of relief or gratitude, but tears of recognition that they were still human, still worthy of dignity, still capable of being part of a better future. And the British soldiers who offered that kindness had demonstrated that victory need not corrupt, that power need not brutalize, and that even in the darkest moments, it is possible to choose humanity over hatred. This is the legacy of Lüneburg, not a grand gesture or a historic treaty, but a series of small acts of decency that, taken together, helped to heal the wounds of war and build the foundation for lasting peace. It is a legacy worth remembering and a lesson worth learning in every generation. If you found this remarkable story of British compassion and German resilience moving, please subscribe to our channel for more untold tales from the Second World War. What other aspects of the war's aftermath would you like us to explore? Share your thoughts in the comments below and help us preserve these important lessons from history. Remember to like this video and share it with anyone interested in the human stories behind the headlines of history.